Ladies and gentlemen, this is what it all comes down to.
Now, we Baptists cherish our doctrinal inheritance. I want to say this without stutter. We are a people of the book.
Payday someday had become a reality in Jezebel's life.
My brother, if the hierarchical approach to the scriptures dominates our institutions and our denomination, there will be no missionaries to hurt. They will cease to exist.
I have no other argument. I need no other plea. It is enough that Jesus died and that he died for me.
In the fertile borderlands of southern Kentucky, northern Tennessee, there's this area where the red clay of Todd County, Kentucky meets the silt of the Cumberland River Valley of northern Tennessee. It's in a little area that we now call Guthrie, and it's a very fertile farm area. And in that area, for a long time, the name Meriwether carried the weight of an empire. I mean, it was a very aristocratic type family. They were known as Southern gentry. And really the man that built that to a long-lasting type of thing was a guy named William Douglas Meriwether. He was born in November of 1809. He was the son of a man named Charles Meriwether, who was a doctor, a medical physician. His mother, Mary, was known as one of the most beautiful women in the American South. One of his grandfathers had been a signatory of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, this family was really involved in just about anything that you'd want to be involved in. His father, being a physician, had served during the Revolutionary War and had been given a large portion of land as reward for his service, and that land was several hundred acres there in what's now called Todd County, Kentucky. And so you could say that he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but in a lot of ways, there were people in that generation that lost everything. I mean, a great many of the southern estates were destroyed or squandered through the Civil War era. And it was under his stewardship that the Maryville estate, as it was known, transitioned from being a subsistence holding into a beacon of regional prosperity. I mean, by the time that William dies, it's a 1,300-acre manor that was known for hospitality in those border counties of southern Kentucky, northern Tennessee. And that through an era in which most people lost everything that they had. So William, he was really kind of a 19th century gentry. He was a 19th century Renaissance man. Anytime he entered a room, he had this commanding sort of presence. He was rooted in the area, not just through his economic and financial advantages, but through his character. When you read his obituary, he dies in 1878. His obituary is like a ledger of a life that you would want to live. It remembers him as a citizen. I think they call him strictly honorable. They say in every transaction he was highly cultivated in both mind and manner. And so you have this estate that people would see in our era as kind of lofty. But even in his epitaph, they remember him as a friend of the poor, a man whose mentorship to young laborers and open-handed charity suggested a human heart that beat beneath a formal waistcoat of a wealthy landowner. I mean, who talks that way about people if they don't have to? Now, William never married. And that was kind of suspicious because he was, despite we have no photos of him, no portraits, which is kind of odd with the Meriwether family. But we are told that he was a tall man, broad-shouldered, had sparkling blue eyes. And so you would think that it would be rather easy for a man looking like that with the wealth that he had to find a wife, but he never did. And there's a story behind that. The woman who most people believe was his romantic interest for the entirety of his life, came into his life in the 1850s. Her name was Sarah Frances King. Most everybody knew her throughout the course of her life as Fanny. She was born August of 1825, late summer, Orange County, Virginia. Her father, who went by H.R. King, his name was Halcomb. He was a plasterer, which is kind of an outdated way of saying he was a drywaller. Her mother was a woman named Mary Ann Peacher. Her early life was very humble. They had these really modest rhythms, her father being a tradesman. Her father ended up moving the family to Tennessee and died in 1838. They were living in the outskirts of what's now called Clarksville, and by 1850, her mother had become so poor that she moved in with her own family, went back to living with her older brother. I believe his name was William Peacher. But Sarah and her brother, a guy named John, found work in Todd County by joining the Meriwether household, and they were going to work for them. Her brother John was a carpenter who worked for the Meriwether family, and Sarah, or Fanny, was a housekeeper. And so the disparity between the two families couldn't be any more stark. I mean, the daughter of a plasterer, she's literally working in the household of this dynastic family whose ancestors signed the Declaration of Independence. And who's, this guy, his father is a medical doctor, and the mother is just this, beauty queen. So her early time in Kentucky would have been very humble. She's a housekeeper for a wealthy family. And then the Civil War breaks out. And it goes exactly how you would expect, only worse. On Christmas Day of 1862, Fanny received word that her brother, John King, who had entered service as a he'd entered as a first sergeant and promoted up. He was a first lieutenant in the 14th Tennessee Infantry. She got word on Christmas Day of 1862 that he had died at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And this just devastated her, because he was her only real male protector. He was the guy who was there for her when her family had really kind of disintegrated into poverty. And so she relied heavily on two things to take the place of her family. The next year, 1863, her mother would die. So she had no family left. Her father was dead. Her mother was dead. Her brother was dead. And she just has abject poverty. So really she has two things that she relies on to take care of her and to help her and to be a family to her. First was the Meriwether family. And she had been taken in as a housekeeper. She was living there at the Maryville estate. But secondly, the only other outside family that she had, other than the Meriwethers, was her church family here at Antioch Baptist Church. The church had been founded in 1818, and in 1860, 1859, had completed this church that I'm sitting in, and 1860 had begun worship here. And so she's been here through the years of building this church. She had been here through the process of plastering it. In all likelihood, her brother had worked on this church, plastering the walls, using the skills that his father had taught him. And so she had been here for the process of building the church, and this had become a family for her. And it's devastating the way that it turned out. Well, as the years passed, you can imagine the line between the master of the house and the housekeeper blurred into somewhat of a domestic arrangement because of the rigid social codes of the era. The distance between this aristocratic Meriwether family and this laborer class King family just made it unthinkable that they would ever wed. So although William and Sarah were very obviously close, most people who knew them defined it as romantic, they chose to continue living together without getting married. They're at the Maryville estate. And she was operating as a housekeeper, just living with this man that she loved and who loved her. And that decision caused a quiet but persistent scrutiny from the community around them. And unfortunately, nowhere was the judgment more palpable than within the walls of Antioch Baptist Church. See, back then, Antioch only met once a month. Our pastor would circulate amongst other churches, and so we would meet on the fourth Sunday of the month, every month, and the church would actually gather the Saturday prior to revise the list of names on the church book. And that wasn't because people were so often moving away and moving to. It was because they were actually deciding who could remain in fellowship and who was to be disciplined and cast out of the church for some sort of a moral failure. And so you can imagine, this church where just over my shoulder here, where you can see this chandelier, there was a big red brick chimney that went up from a furnace, and so the church would have been full of this thick wood smoke, and you could almost hear the clerk's pen scratching on these little papers as the moral accounts of the members of the church were settled. The archival record that we have here at Antioch, going all the way back to 1818, records that Fanny was disciplined out of the church. We know that this took place around February 1868. The word that's right next to her name is just excluded. And it's very clearly written, steady hand. It's written starkly in the ledger. It's a formal dismissal, severing her from the congregation's graces. It was kind of a public branding in a lot of ways. It was a rejection of her and whatever she had done. We can only assume that it was her relationship with William, living with a man that she wasn't wed to. We might expect maybe the events that take place among two adults when they live together. And so this just resulted in her being rejected for cohabitation by the church. But they never actually wrote that down. So here you have the spring of 1868. We're freshly removed from the Civil War, and they exclude this woman, but they don't actually enter into the ledger the reason why she had been excluded. And we think that it's because this would have inevitably meant that they would have had to note who she was living with. They would have had to written down somewhere the paramour with whom she was cohabitating. And that would have resulted in a very public criticism of one of the wealthiest and most well-respected figures in the county at that time. So while they were perfectly comfortable, we might say, branding Fanny with shame, bringing shame on William was unfortunately unacceptable in 19th century Todd County. Well, the church's rejection was merely the prelude to a far more visceral terror that would come on them just a couple of weeks later. It was March 1868, just a couple of weeks after Fanny had been formally excluded from the church here at Antioch. A group of men were riding into Maryville around dusk. They arrived there, and they were wearing these old, torn up and tattered gray army uniforms. They're kind of looking like ghosts of the Confederacy. Not they were trying to look like ghosts, but they were just wearing these old uniforms. And they claimed to be these weary, formal soldiers in search of a meal. And here's William and Sarah, and they had actually 5 guests over for dinner that night. And as they look at these guys, it's almost undoubtedly the case that they would have seen in the uniforms and the faces of these men the images of men that they knew who had fought for the Confederacy and died for the Confederacy only 3 or 4 years earlier, including Sarah's brother John, who was buried only about 50 feet from the porch that they were standing on. And so they invite these men in, they invite them to have a meal with them, but the mask of civility would slip as soon as the meal was over. The leader of the group, this guy who's described as a stoop-shouldered, blue-eyed man, he identifies himself with this high-pitched voice as Dingus, which is a insane nickname, but it's a very common alias used by Jesse James. And Jesse James stands up, he levels a weapon at William, and he lets him know that they want $10,000. And the only reason that they expected that was because they had been informed that William had $10,000 somewhere on the premises. Well, William, by all accounts, he stays composed. He insists that he has no such money on the premises. But the gang there, they don't believe him, of course. Why would they? And so they actually tie and put a noose around his neck, and they drag him outside. And he's gasping for air there in the candlelight, and somebody shouts, "Just string him up under that big oak tree." And the idea was they were going to intimidate him, but he just wouldn't be intimidated. So somebody finally leans in and they say, "We know that you recently sold a load of tobacco, and we have heard rumored that you have hidden the money here on the premises." And so the guy just very quietly and calmly says, "If you don't tell us where the money is, we're going to snap your neck like a matchstick." That was his words. We're going to snap your neck like a matchstick. So here's William and he's standing under these massive trees in his own backyard. And he comes up with this plan where he tells them, "Okay, yeah, you've got me. You can have the money, but I don't have it here." And he says, "You can check my bank book. It's in my pocket. I recently made a deposit at the Long Bank in Russellville." So they check his bank book. He had made a deposit. They didn't have the total for the deposit there in the bank book, but it had noted that he had made a deposit at the Long Bank in Russellville. And so he says, "I made the deposit. I wouldn't ever keep that much money here on my estate, but it's at the Long Bank in Russellville." And so the gang, they leave, and they have this plan. And in fact, only a few days later, March 20th, 1868, Jesse James and the gang do rob the first bank that they'll ever rob. It was the Southern Bank of Kentucky, which at that point was known as the Nimrod Long Bank there in Russellville. And so they made off with something like $9,000 in cash and another $3,000 to $5,000 worth of gold and silver. Cleverly enough, almost none of which belonged to William Meriwether. So he saved his friends, he saved his own neck, and the decade that followed was not good to them. William's mother died. Fanny was there taking care of her until she died, 1869. And in very short time, most of the Meriwether family would either move away or die. And as William got older and he came to understand that nobody would be left to take care of Fanny, he started taking steps to make sure that she would be taken care of because of his own provisions. And so in his will, December 1877, he drafted legal protections rooted in what he called a remembrance of Fanny's kindness and fidelity. And so what he did was he left her $1,000, which was a sizable chunk of money back then. It was to actually stay invested, and she was to live off the interest that it paid for the rest of her life. He also left her a place to live. He didn't leave her any land exactly, but he left her a place to live on the Fairfield farm, saying that she was to live there until the time of her death. And also, he actually appointed his brother, a guy named James Hunter, and his nephew, a guy named John Walton, J.W. Meriwether, to be her overseers, kind of taking care of her for the rest of her life. And so when William dies, November 6th, 1878, he leaves behind a massive property, like I said, over 1,300 acres. And in his will, one of the only people that he takes specific care of is Fanny. And so although they had never married, he sort of, I would think it's fair to say he made clear she was to be taken care of as if she was his wife. Well, in the final chapter of her life, Fanny, she found this really strange level of acceptance from the people around her who had always kind of ostracized her. Late in the 1870s, suddenly you find her on the books again here at Antioch. She's a member in good standing, which is odd. It's not odd that happened. That happened frequently where someone would be excluded from the church and then later added back into good fellowship. It's just odd that she would come back. That's not all that usual. She did live with William's nephew, J.W. She was not a housekeeper for him. She was in her 60s at this point. And so she lived with him more or less as a guest. Matter of fact, in the 1880 census, this is a really big deal. In the 1880 census, J.W. officially recorded her as his aunt. And so bear in mind, this is William's nephew. And so for J.W. to refer to Fanny as his aunt was a huge thing because they were not in any way related. So this was kind of his signification that she had been permanently integrated into the Meriwether family. And it was almost like a legitimizing of her. It was an honorary title that even in the post-mortem, she was considered to be William's wife. And the community there in Guthrie and across Todd County, they had a shift in the same way. In her obituary, she's described as a woman with a well-cultivated mind. She was described as being a constant reader. She was esteemed for her piety. just means her solidarity and religiousness. She was considered a highly religious woman. She was known for her gentleness, for her charity. And so this woman who had once been struck from the church ledger was being mourned as this paragon of feminine Christian virtue. And so it's kind of incredible how that her reputation was healed and changed. November 1888, she gets a case of bronchitis. It becomes pneumonia. And so I think it was November 21st of 1888, she died at the age of 63. She was importantly buried in the Meriwether family cemetery there at Maryville. She was buried next to her brother, who had also been buried in that cemetery. But interestingly, she's buried a few feet away from William. And so even though she was acknowledged as his romantic partner, as his spouse, you might say, and even legitimized by his nephew, who called her his aunt, she was not buried next to him. And it is fair because they were never legally married, I suppose. But burial within that family's inner sanctum provided her with sort of a final silent answer that she did belong to the Meriwether family, and she was one of them.